My name is Mary and I work for Trócaire. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we, over the past 2 years, have brought Palestine and then Gaza in particular into our education resources and materials. So quickly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the justice learning journey that we embarked on in 2022 and why we decided to focus on Palestine as part of that, and how we brought the current crisis in Gaza into our most recent materials. And I'll show some examples and highlight some of the methodologies that can be used by development educators in the current context. So just quickly in terms of context, in 2022, we embarked on a 3-year learning journey on justice. So we had taken a 3-year learning journey approach to our materials in the past, one around climate and one around the SDGs. And we decided in 2022 to embark on this justice learning journey. So this was part of a process for the development education team in really regrounding into a justice and rights-based approach, embedding critical methodologies and applying a power and systems analysis where possible. We also really wanted to centre the voices of young people as much as possible, as the people best placed to talk about how injustice impacts on their daily lives. So as part of that process, we identified Palestine as a place where we would have the opportunity through our partners to talk directly to young people, and where we could gather content and stories that would really readily lend themselves to highlighting injustice through multiple lenses. So we were fortunate enough, myself and some colleagues, to travel to the West Bank in 2022 to meet with some of our partners and young people and start collecting that content with a view to it being used over the next 2 to 3 years. So each year, the resource had a specific justice-based focus, but it is important to mention that our resources haven't solely focused on Palestine. In order to highlight the global nature of the issues we were looking at, we would look at several countries in any given year. So in 2023, we looked at global justice in broad terms, and we used stories and content from Somalia, Guatemala, and Palestine. And then in 2024, our resources focused on water justice, and the focus was in Malawi and Palestine. So part of why we decided to focus on Palestine is that we knew from our programs and from our partners in Palestine that we would be able to access young people and communities in a way that's not always possible in the different countries where Trócaire is present. We knew that there would be multiple examples of injustice and oppression, and that these would really bring to life the concepts of justice, equality, and fairness that we could then deliver in an age-appropriate way across all of our audiences. And just to say that Trócaire's resources are target young people and educators from early years right through to youth. So early childhood, junior and senior primary, post-primary, and youth. So we need to collect content that can be that we can work with across all of those age groups. And those concepts of justice, equality, and fairness were also easily linked into existing frameworks that can provide an accessible entry point for educators in exploring global issues. For example, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And also just to say that while Trócaire have worked in the occupied Palestinian territories through our partners for decades, this was a new departure for the development education team. We had a huge amount to learn, and we continue to have a huge amount to learn. So at no point did we consider ourselves experts. So we were very much on our own learning journey as well. So in 2023, some of the justice lens that we took focused around kind of freedom of movement, the right to play, and safety. And we also really focused on activism and action in our partner organisations in our communities to really show again that global citizenship angle of how people were taking action against the injustice that they were facing. 2024, as I said, the focus was around water access and water equity. So who controls the water? What is the impact of that power imbalance? What are the impacts on people's lives when they don't have access to enough clean, safe water? And then we used water as that lens to look at what was happening in Gaza. In just a little bit more context, so we had already begun the process of developing our materials in July, August 2023. So they were already at quite an advanced stage when the events of October 7th happened. So in 2023, we developed the materials focused a lot on the history and the context of the region. They were more focused on the West Bank because that's where we had been able to travel to in 2022, but that they had taken that kind of broad overview of the region. So we knew in 2024 we didn't really need to get back into that wider context too much. And we had included Gaza in our water justice resources because water access had always been a pressing issue under the blockade and was one of the ways that we could show that power imbalance. After October 7th, we knew we needed to bring more focus to Gaza and give a little bit more detail on the wider context and the history of Gaza, but still using water justice as a lens to look at that crisis. Also, we were writing these materials in October, November. So we didn't know what way things would be in January when the resources would be published. So we wanted to make sure that that the resources would still be relevant in January and beyond as well for any educators who wanted to look at this area. We also needed to consider the wider context of Trócaire's work, including our advocacy and communications work and the position of our partners in both Gaza and the West Bank, some of whom we've worked with for decades. So there was a wider organisational context to be considered as well. Like I said, we knew that we needed to keep the resources as relevant. And also one of the ways in which the water justice lens really kind of lent itself to this approach was that the concept of water and access to water is relatable across all age groups. Everyone understands water as a basic need, and everyone understands what happens when you don't have access to enough clean, safe water. There was also some media coverage around around access to water in Gaza at this time. And so we were able to use that as an accessible and digestible kind of concept or lens to look at the wider context of what was happening in Gaza. And as water, food and fuel were blocked in early October, we were able to draw that out to the fact that Israel controls most of the water, controls the water sources in the region, and that water distribution had always been unequal, and that was one of the ways in which the lives of Palestinians were controlled. We were also able to highlight the impact of the lack of water in a humanitarian crisis. We were working with reasonably limited content because the usual channels that we would access new content through weren't available to us. We weren't able to visit Gaza, obviously, and our partners weren't able to provide content or stories in the usual way. So we were working with content that was available in the media and had to be very mindful of what content we were using, not only due to the DOCAS code, but also ensuring the content was age appropriate and that we were upholding the dignity of the people of Gaza at that time. So just to talk quickly about some of the lessons that we learned through the process of including Palestine in our education materials over the last 2 years. So this can feel like an overwhelming area or an overwhelming issue to approach. And we have found that educators have generally been lacking in confidence to talk about Palestine and to talk about Gaza. And there can be all sorts of reasons for this, including maybe the young people in their class. There can be a fear or hesitancy around saying the wrong thing, offending someone, getting something wrong, getting some backlash. And also for educators, they're working with young people who are consuming a lot of media and a lot of information from all sorts of different sources. So from our perspective, using an accessible hook like water can really help educator confidence. So in using that justice and rights-based approach, you can, for example, establish what basic needs are and the universal nature of human rights. Then look at what are some of the reasons why some people have these rights denied and others don't. Who holds the power in those situations and who benefits from those situations? For younger children, you can talk about fairness, whether or not something is fair. And in our case, it was looking at what injustice looked like in different parts of the world and bringing Palestine into that picture as part of a wider global issue. And then focusing in on Gaza. Also looking at the situation before and after October 7th also showed that, things didn't start on October 7th. There was a whole history and context before that. And it also enabled us to keep the focus on a justice and power analysis of why water was always an issue in Gaza and who held the power in that situation. Other lessons that we learned was it can be challenging to identify an action component for young people. So for us, that was really focusing on the solidarity angle. Solidarity is one of Trócaire's organisational values, but also in this context, really showing the importance of solidarity in a crisis like this. So also, again, in terms of building educator confidence, but also for ourselves as development educators and trying to identify how to come at this issue, it's using established approaches. So using existing frameworks that were on methodologies that we're all familiar with. So critical questioning. So asking why? If somebody says, oh, well, Hamas, attacked Israeli civilians on October 7th. Okay, well, why? Why did that happen? And then keep drilling down into that, why, to really draw out that critical questioning and analysis. We used a power map and a power analysis in one of our post-primary activities. In the senior primary, we would have talked about a lot about children's rights, for example, the right to play, but also the right to have your basic needs met. And we use activities like giant steps and then looking at barriers or challenges and solutions. So again, very established methodologies. So you don't need to be an expert in the history of Palestine to be able to bring these methodologies into your practice. Centering young people and really giving young people the opportunity to tell their own story and to highlight the injustice in ways that we're just not able to do was very powerful, particularly in 2023 and the global justice resources for us. And also using visuals and video. We used a lot of visuals of the wall in the West Bank. We used a lot of visuals of water tanks and of settlements that would show, for example, a swimming pool in a settlement, and then a village where the only access to water is through water tanks. And again, that can get across a concept that can be quite complex to explain, but a visual can really get that across in a very powerful way. So that's a summary of the lessons learned. Just in terms of, I'm not going to go into these too much, just in terms of time. I actually have a timer on my screen, which is quite helpful. But for example, we developed a PowerPoint to really give that kind of context, break down the context and provide in-depth educator notes, again, to support that educator confidence, and also link it to the other activities. We produced a water justice video that I'm going to show a little bit of now. And as I said, we developed a water and power activity for use at post-primary, which brought in that power analysis and looking at the barriers and the causes of why those barriers existed. So that's all the talking I'm going to do. I'm going to show a little bit of the water justice video, I think of about 3 minutes. So I'm just going to show the Palestine part. Just to say this video has partners, but not young people, because the young people didn't talk about water in the interviews that we did with them.
Occupied Palestinian territory. Access to safe and affordable water for Palestinians is a big challenge, and many people struggle to fulfill their basic water needs. Since 1967, Israel has controlled the water sources and water systems in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Some Palestinians in the West Bank are not connected to the main water system, and others have limited access to water. This contributes to high levels of poverty among many Palestinian communities. People like Lubna and Sarit are working for justice and equality in the occupied Palestinian territories, including ensuring equal access to water.
Israel controls all the water resources in the West Bank and only allows Palestinians to have access to very small quantities that are nowhere near enough to what we need on a day-to-day basis. So imagine not being able to flush your toilet, not being able to wash your dishes, not being able to take a shower, not being able to wash your hands or brush your teeth because you don't have water.
Israeli settlements in the West Bank are communities where Israeli citizens live on land that has been stolen from Palestinians. These settlements are illegal under international law. Israelis living in the settlements have unlimited access to clean, safe water, while Palestinians living in nearby villages often have no choice but to buy water to store in large tanks.
Israel has established civilian communities here that enjoy all of these benefits like land and water, and while at the same time virtually all of the Palestinian communities around here do not receive the same services. Israel does not allow them, for example, to build, construct and develop according to the needs of the community.
In the Gaza Strip, access to water has always been a serious challenge. Israel placed Gaza under a blockade in 2007, and this made the movement of people and materials in and out of Gaza almost impossible. It was very difficult to get the materials and equipment in that were needed to maintain the water treatment system, and this meant that over 90% of the water from Gaza's main water source, the coastal aquifer, was considered unsafe to drink. Following horrific attacks by Hamas on Israeli civilians, since October 2023, almost the entire population of Gaza has been forced to leave their homes due to the bombardment from the Israeli military. They are living in overcrowded and unsafe conditions. Homes, schools and hospitals have been badly damaged or destroyed by bombs and missiles, and there is not enough fuel, food or clean water. Water pipes, reservoirs and water treatment stations have been destroyed during the attacks by Israel. Many people have no choice but to drink dirty water or water from the sea. This lack of access to clean water in particular has a serious impact on health and sanitation, especially for children, in a situation where people have already lost so much. This is an injustice.
From that video, there was an introduction and a piece on Malawi and a conclusion, but I will pop the link into the Google document for anyone who's interested in seeing the whole video. So that's all for me at this point.
Adding to the great things that Mary already mentioned and the great work of Trócaire, in Amnesty International, we've spent over 4 years doing research on the situation in Palestine, taking the context and the history of the conflict. And in February 2022, we published our research that speaks and explains why Israel is implementing a system of apartheid against the Palestinian people. Adding to that, also we speak about it in context of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So usually I go a lot to schools to do workshops and to colleges, and that's where I start the conversation. I bring them the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, show them all 30 articles, and we speak about it, and we speak about what rights are there in Ireland, what rights maybe are missing in Ireland, and then we take to the wider context of the world, and then we speak about Palestine itself. We give examples on how it's working in Palestine and how Palestinian peoples are not getting these rights like anyone else. And from that also we bring some examples. For example, there was a child called Nasser Eliazi in August 2020. He was waiting on leaving Gaza to do a surgery in East Jerusalem in a Palestinian hospital, and he wasn't granted the permission. He was 18 months then, and then by the age of 2, while waiting on his permit, he died. So we speak about how the system of apartheid didn't allow him to leave because he's a Palestinian, while if he was an Israeli citizen, he would have, or a Jewish Israeli, he would have been maybe airlifted if it's urgent. And that's how the lives of the Palestinians are seen as less than the lives of the Israeli Jewish people. And then speaking about Gaza, just to use my time wisely, I know 15 minutes, you can't really pack too much in it. But the escalation of the conflict or the war in Gaza, between Israel and Gaza, it's something that really didn't happen out of nowhere. And we know the armed conflict between Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories have been going on for a very long time. And the present situation after 7th of October, where Hamas killed over 120 people with other armed group, Palestinian armed group, and took hostages from Israel, that didn't happen out of nowhere, because in 2007, for example, there was the blockade, the illegal blockade on Gaza Strip imposed, where everything is restricted. No one can leave Gaza without permission. Nothing can enter Gaza without Israel allowing whatever is going on. So this was a system of isolating Gaza from the world and isolating them also from other Palestinians who are in the West Bank or in East Jerusalem. Now, another issue is the denial of the right to return for the refugees in Gaza itself, because over 70% of the people in Gaza, which is like around 1.5 million, are refugees. They're originally from cities, are now what's called now Israel. And the United Nations acknowledges their right to return, but they can't return there because it's completely now different cities, different houses, different villages. So they are being stuck, cramped in Gaza in a very dense area. Now, adding to that as well, we try to explain the difference between, for example, the humanitarian, international humanitarian law and international human rights, where international human rights are the rights that all humans should be entitled to and should be given, regardless if it's peace or war, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other instruments. But we focus more during conflict time on explaining what the international humanitarian law, because it applies in conflicts. And you would have some people questioning, or some students sometimes, they would say, yeah, why would this law be implemented while the armed group in Gaza carried their attacks on Israel? So yeah, we say even if what they did was wrong, killing civilians is wrong, but it should not be also encountered by killing civilians from the other side. And now the international humanitarian law is really very important in protecting civilians in these conflicts. Now, the first thing, the armed forces or attacking forces should not displace any person or evacuate any person. But as we see the situation folding in Gaza now, the majority of the residents in Gaza have run away to the south, to Rafah, a very small area, and they are locked there. They can't even leave to Egypt or anywhere. And these civilians should not have been displaced or evacuated in these situations, because you'd be out of your home, which means you have nothing really to take with you more than a bag in this war, if you manage to take a bag. And yeah, Israel instruction of the 1.1 million people who are living in the north of Gaza to be evacuated they were dropping leaflets for them, asking them to leave. This goes against international humanitarian law, and it's a violation of it. These things usually students are not aware. These instruments are there to protect civilians, and then there should be a humanitarian access to medical care, to relief, and aid workers should always be protected and shouldn't be targeted. But Amnesty International has people on the ground who are researching what's going on and trying to document war crimes or the violation of the humanitarian law. And they found that some medical staff were deliberately attacked, hospitals have been bombed, and all parties, for example, including Israel, Egypt, and Gaza, should allow the aid to enter Gaza. But now we know there's a lot of aid trucks are waiting at the borders. So again, for students, in the school, we explain to them how this aid should enter Gaza and shouldn't be blocked by any means. The other things is that the conduct of hostility. So an appropriate response should always be on the policies of whoever would retaliate, and there are rules in fighting. So yeah, during wars, even wars should have rules, and this means both sides, Israelis and Palestinian armed groups, including Hamas, that's having a lot of the hostages, Israeli ones, must respect this international humanitarian law and cease to indiscriminately attack people, especially when there are areas that are full of civilians. If you want to attack areas like this, you should know that there are a lot of civilians that will go as casualty, and you can't say this is just collateral damage, because you should do every measure to prevent that. But Israeli military response, it appeared that it doesn't really follow this rule of the international humanitarian law. Now there are a lot of other restrictions on the people of Gaza, and that violates another rule. Like, for example, there is no electricity for them, there is no water for them, there is no food for them to be supplied by Gaza, by Israel. And Israel, as an occupier, they have a duty, according to international law, to provide these things to the people they occupy. And we see that top officials from the Israeli side stated that they will starve Gaza, and stated that there will be no electricity or water. And the previous presentation about water was really, really essential to see, even in the West Bank, outside this context, or outside this war physically, water has been taken away from the Palestinians. And in Gaza, it's even worse. People don't have clean water, and we know diseases and epidemics can spread wildly because of lack of hygiene and because of lack of medical care and lack of medical supplies. And most of the hospitals are dysfunctional now because they have been destroyed by the Israeli forces. Now, I can share later on this document with you, but all these rules, we explain them one by one to the students, and to see why, or sorry, to show why the humanitarian, the international humanitarian law is something that should be like, if I may say this, like the Bible of the war. Even if you want to attack armed groups, you should not attack civilians, or not consider that there are civilians in that area. Now we explain what's lawful and what's unlawful in these situations from a human rights lens. So shooting enemies who are soldiers or fighters, or maybe capturing fighters to get some information from them to reduce the damage, are things that can be lawful. But also you should allow humanitarian aid work to bring food and medicine to civilians. You cannot target medical staff or relief staff. Now there should be zones that are safe, and none of the fighters or the two parties that are fighting are in them. But there are unlawful things like shooting enemy soldiers that have surrendered, for example, and laid down their arms, shelling a hospital or a school in which it's not used for military purposes. And there were a lot of evidence that some of the UN schools that were only sheltering displaced people have been bombed. Another thing also, firing rockets, for example, from areas that are populated by civilians, is against the international humanitarian law, and it's unlawful. Bombing military targets in this proportionate way, where, you know, if you exceed using the power, the civilians around it will be killed. Targeting the main resources, like, for example, targeting water whales or tanks, or targeting the essential supply of the city to inhibit civilians from getting their water or getting their electricity, is also unlawful. Yeah, or even taking hostages, civilians as hostages, using human shield. All these things are unlawful in this war. Now there are a few methods. Later on, maybe when I send this document, you can look at them. For example, the conflict between the state of Israel and Hamas is too complex for international humanitarian law. An easy way to debunk this is just to say international humanitarian law applies to everyone regardless, and the principles of international humanitarian law, such as the protection of civilians and medical staff, or even hostages or detained people, it applies for everyone. Sometimes some people would say it's permissible to target civilians' infrastructure if they are suspected military operations. That area also, that's another myth that we need to debunk, because sometimes the armed group that's carrying on the hostility will use this myth for their advantage. And there are several things in this document that are related to the humanitarian law. However, I put on the document, the Google document, I put a link to 90 minutes course in it's available in several languages, and it explains the system of apartheid before the 7th of October. And there is a video as well, a link, 14 minutes, I usually play for the students, that explains the system of apartheid as well against Palestinians in the West Bank, citizens of Israel in Gaza, and even in East Jerusalem. And another thing, we have an action link, which is a petition to call for ceasefire. I inserted that as well, and I will be sending on the documents to you. I think my time should be finished now. Is that right? Or do you
Great.
still have them?
Thanks, Talha. Yeah, you're just about a minute left if you want to finish up with anything else. But
yeah,
thank you.
just one thing to again emphasize on that the conflict started on the 7th of October is one of the myths as well, because as we explained before, the system of apartheid against the Palestinians, including in Gaza, have been going on for a very long time, and 16 years of blockade on Gaza is something really unbearable for a population, inhumane, and it's against a humanitarian law, and it's against the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Thank you.
Previous speakers and Talha particularly have covered some of the ground already very eloquently for me, so I won't. I'll try not to duplicate or repeat, but I really just wanted to do two things really in the time that I have. So I'm kind of speaking as, you know, in some ways with two hats on, one as an international lawyer, and another then as an educator. I teach, as Claire said, at the University of Maynooth, at the School of Law Criminology there. And I'm also involved in Academics for Palestine and a number of other groups in the higher education sector. And like probably a lot of the sectors that we're all in, there have been various the debates and struggles and contestations going on around, you know, the response or the lack of response and the inadequacy of the response of the institutions and the universities, particularly in our context. And so I'm happy to speak about that. But I also have, you know, the particular context of my own students and their interests as well. So the first part, the international law part, I'll just try and say a little bit just in kind of response to the theme of, you know, we need to speak about Gaza, how international law can be one useful language for speaking about it, about Gaza, particularly about Palestine more generally. One of you know, a number of languages, and not by any means to say it's the only or the most useful, but it has particular value in certain senses, which I'll try and touch on. And then the second part then is more broadly around, you know, in response to that question of we need to speak about Gaza, to think about why it is that we need to speak about Gaza. Why is it so important, not just for, you know, the rights of Palestinians themselves, but for all of us as humanity and global society more broadly, and why in particular we shouldn't be afraid to speak about Gaza or about Palestine, and to just maybe offer a couple of thoughts and tools on that as well, because I know it is obviously you know, there are fears and concerns and sensitivities that people have. So okay, so on the first part, in terms of the language, what I've called there on the slide, the language the utility of the language of international law. So I suppose one broad thing I would say is, because of how contentious some of the debates and the discourse around Palestine is, it can be, you know, we can get lost in a lot of back and forth in terms of, you know, moral debates, political debates, and so on. And so in one sense, what international lawyers will say is that, you know, the language of international law, the rulings that we have, the documents that we have from institutions and courts of international law give us, you know, as much as it can be possible, give us a detached, independent view of the situation, and can be useful to kind of extract in that sense some sense from in understanding it. And so I've just put a load of different phrases and concepts on the slide there. Like I said, Talha has covered a lot of it, particularly in relation to human rights and humanitarian law. The first kind of set there, if we think about from the, I suppose, the positive freedom and rights and emancipatory point of view from the Palestinian perspective, we can talk about, you know, how Palestinians do, like all peoples, have human rights. That includes a right to self-determination that all peoples have. The International Court of Justice and various UN bodies have been very clear that the Palestinians do have a right to self-determination in international law, that this idea that they can be kept indefinitely under external foreign military occupation, that, you know, doesn't have any validity or legitimacy from an international law perspective. The right to self-determination is linked to the idea of territorial integrity of your territory, right? And it's established that the Palestinians at least have self-determination rights over the West Bank and Gaza. That means that, you know, that is a unified territorial entity that can't be separated or fragmented in the way that the Israeli occupation has systematically done for so long, both in terms of isolating Gaza and keeping it under blockade and siege, but also the fragmentation of the West Bank and the way the settlements and the wall and the infrastructure have been used to divide up Palestinians and fragment them from each other. Mary spoke a lot about water, and, you know, sovereignty over natural resources is another element of, you know, the rights that people have under international law as part of their self-determination, as part of their control over their own economic affairs and over their own resources. That's, you know, very definitively set out in a number of UN resolutions and documents. And so all this to say, I suppose, that, you know, there's lots of legal resources there that give support to these concepts. The right to return of Palestinian refugees is also enshrined in UN resolutions, and no matter what Israel may say about it, there is a comprehensive right of return for all Palestinian refugees, including the successive generations, because they have been a displaced population for so long now. We're into the fourth generation of Palestinian refugees, but they all are defined legally as Palestine refugees, covered by the work and the mandate of the UNRWA agency, and have that inalienable right to return to their homeland. So that's all, you know, in terms of the protection of the positive rights of Palestinians. We have a lot then in terms of what's prohibited under international law. We've heard about war crimes and other forms of violations of humanitarian law, so I won't repeat that in terms of what's permitted and not permitted in the conflict context. But there are, you know, from a broader kind of public international law point of view, we have prohibitions, very clear prohibitions on annexation of territory, which Israel has violated in the way that it's formally annexed parts of Jerusalem, informally or unofficially, but very much in practice annexed large swathes of the West Bank. The prohibition of things like collective punishment, we can see very starkly in Gaza over the last number of months. And Shane Darcy, some of you may know, professor from the Human Rights Centre in Galway, who's written books on collective punishment and studied collective punishment for many years, and he was writing earlier in the context of the war on Gaza before Christmas that this is, you know, of all of the histories and examples of collective punishment that he's studied over the course of his career, that what's happening in Gaza at the moment is by far the most egregious and extreme violation of that prohibition on collective punishment. So it's I was struck by, on Mary's video earlier, we had the big illegal word flashing up on the screen and over the picture of the settlement, and that's, you know, again, one of the areas under international law where there's, you know, there's absolutely no argument. You know, Israel has its team of international lawyers and military lawyers that will try to come up with justifications for why torture is not actually torture, it's enhanced interrogation techniques, and it's permitted in certain circumstances, or why, okay, we're not allowed to kill civilians in general, but in this context, they can be legitimate or lawful collateral damage, etc. And they'll try to use some of the gray areas to muddy the waters, to bring their legal arguments to justify, the completely unjustifiable things that are being done. But when it comes to the question of settlements and the colonization of occupied territory, the transfer of civilian population into an occupied territory, there's no room for argument at all. It's very clear that this is prohibited by the Fourth Geneva Convention, and even Israel's strongest supporters in the UN, the likes of the US, have, their formal position is that the settlements are illegal. We have UN Security Council resolutions, and some of the few we know, many of you probably know, that the US has a tendency to veto any criticism or condemnation of Israel that comes up in a UN Security Council resolution. But as recently as 2016, we had, we have a strong resolution from the UN Security Council that the US didn't oppose, which again reiterates that the settlements are absolutely illegal and must be dismantled. And so we have, strong and clear kind of language on a number of these elements that we can refer to and use if there is any attempts in spaces that we're in, discussions we're having to try to complicate things or contest things, that we have this body of materials. And I'm happy to share, UN documents. I'm not sure how much people want to get into the weeds of all the legalistic materials and terminology, but I'm happy to share some resources that might be useful. And the final two there that are the final three, maybe that I'll just highlight before I go on to the next piece, the question of illegal occupation, because there is one of the uncertainties over international law. The assumption was always that a military occupation of a territory is a temporary situation after a conflict or a war situation, as it was, for example, in Europe after the Second World War, that you have a transition period for the losing power, or the, in case of Europe, the fascist regimes to be fully dismantled, and for a new stable regime and governance system to come in to take power before full sovereignty would be handed back by the Allied powers, as it was in the case of the Second World War. And so the assumption was this would always be a very temporary transition phase at the end of a war or a conflict. Israel has used that as a way to maintain a kind of indefinite control over the West Bank and Gaza. And we're now into 56, 57 years of occupation. And so that question has been asked at some point, that presumption of temporariness has to be, questioned. And because of how long the occupation has gone on, because of how extensive the settlement construction has been, and because of these elements of apartheid as well that the Amnesty report and others have highlighted so meticulously, you have, this question that is now, somebody may have seen the hearings last week was being discussed in the International Court of Justice, where the UN General Assembly has asked the court to rule on the legal consequences of the occupation going on for so long, with all of the structural domination and discrimination that's involved in it. And so we'll likely have an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice later this year to say something to the effect, most likely that the occupation has become illegal, or has elements of illegal colonization and annexation and systematic racial discrimination as part of it, and has to be dismantled. So, and that brings me then to the final couple of points on apartheid and genocide, because these are, in some ways the most contentious, or have been some of the most contentious terminologies. And even, up until not that long ago, maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, some of the Palestinian human rights organizations themselves were reluctant still to use the framework of apartheid to describe the Israeli regime, because it had been, because it was seen as contentious or sensitive. We've had lots of analysis from Palestinian intellectuals and sociologists and activists over many decades, going back to 1948, about the, how Israel is an apartheid regime essentially. But it took time for the legal analysis to catch up with that. And it is clear under, there is a prohibition on apartheid under international law. Again, that's not specific to South Africa, that is universal in its application, and that is being violated by the Israeli state. And the same when it comes to genocide. We have the Genocide Convention. The image there is the South African legal team at the International Court of Justice in that separate case that they've brought against Israel for committing genocide in the context of Gaza over the past number of months. I'm happy to speak more about that in the questions if people are interested. But there we have already a provisional ruling from the International Court of Justice, as you probably know, that has said that it is plausible that Israel is perpetrating a genocide in Gaza and therefore has to refrain from doing so, prevent its military from continuing to do so. And that gives a lot of, that language from the International Court of Justice as the supreme judicial body in the UN system gives a lot of weight and legitimacy to what Palestinians would have been saying for a long time, that there is a genocidal intention and campaigns on the part of Israel to eliminate or erase the Palestinian people. But again, people would have been wary of using that language because of the sensitivities, because of the certain forms of kind of gatekeeping around what can be defined as genocide and what can't, because of the particular history of the Holocaust atrocities and so on. And so again, having that language from the International Court of Justice gives a strong weight and support to that. So I'm conscious of the time. I think I'm pretty much up on my time. I'll just say a couple of things very quickly on the other slide. And some of this is very obvious, and some of you will won't need this to be emphasized, but this idea that Palestine is not just a question for protecting the rights of the Palestinians. It is a litmus test for how we view the world and engage with each other in solidarity much more generally. And there is this question that has been asked many times, what would I do if I was living through slavery or apartheid or genocide? And the answer is that you're doing it right now. And so this idea that particularly the escalation of genocide in Gaza in the last number of months is the most extreme kind of phase that we've had in Palestine for a long time. And I'd encourage everyone to have a look at the speech that the Colombian president Gustavo Petro made at the COP summit back before Christmas, where he talked about what's happening in Gaza as a rehearsal for the future. This is not how we respond to what's happening to Palestinians now. It tells us how we will respond to the atrocities that will come if we continue on this trajectory of climate catastrophe that we're on, where there will come a time where there will be people fleeing, there will be restraints on resources, and there will be potentially mass violence being perpetrated because of that. And so thinking about Palestine in relation to broader climate justice and ecological struggles and so on. And so I had a couple of points as well, which I'll maybe, if people want to hear more about just how we can respond and some of the tools that we have to respond to the attempts to silence and clamp down and restrict people speaking about Palestine on the last couple of points there. But I'm conscious of the time. I better stop now. Thanks very much.